It was a tense moment on a quiet street when Officer Ethan Grayson, fueled by suspicion and prejudice, stopped Naomi Harper, a poised black woman driving a luxury car with her family. What began as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a confrontation dripping with thinly veiled hostility. Naomi's calm defiance only fueled Ethan's need for control. But when he planted a bag of white powder at her feet, thinking he could frame her without consequence, the crowd of onlookers erupted in outrage, their phones capturing every second. In a twist of poetic justice, Naomi revealed her badge as a police captain, turning the tide against Ethan in an unforgettable moment of accountability. But before we dive deeper into this gripping story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more compelling narratives. It was an ordinary morning on a quiet suburban street, the kind of morning where the world seemed to take a deep breath and settle into the slow rhythm of the day. The trees lining the road swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the pavement. A few early risers were out jogging, and the air was crisp, the sky just beginning to show the first light of dawn. It was the kind of peaceful scene that most people took for granted. But for Officer Ethan Grayson, it was just another opportunity to keep watch. Sitting in his patrol car, Ethan's eyes were constantly scanning the area, searching for anything that seemed out of place. He had been a cop for over 8 years, and the quiet suburb where he patrolled had always been a safe haven. Nothing ever happened here, or so it seemed. He was the kind of officer who prided himself on keeping the peace, even when it meant looking for trouble in places others might not see it. His partner Rachel sat beside him, her eyes focused on her phone, catching up on the latest news. It had been a slow morning, the streets devoid of the usual hustle and bustle. But then, a sleek black sedan passed by. The car was like a contrast to the stillness of the street, its polished surface gleaming under the morning sun. Inside the car, Naomi Harper sat in the passenger seat, dressed elegantly in a black dress, her husband Daniel beside her, with their 2 children, Ella and Mason, in the backseat. Naomi's poise and quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the unease that suddenly began to stir in Ethan. Ethan's sharp eyes followed the car as it glided down the road. Something about it caught his attention. The vehicle looked far too expensive for a family in this neighborhood. As a cop, he had seen a lot of people driving fancy cars that didn't match their lifestyle. And something about Naomi's calm demeanor unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He muttered under his breath to his partner, his voice laced with suspicion. "That car doesn't make sense." Rachel looked up from her phone, raising an eyebrow at his comment. What have they done wrong? Ethan's eyes narrowed as he watched the car continue on its way. "I don't know," he said dismissively, "but I'm going to stop them." Without waiting for a response, he flipped on the lights and signaled the black sedan to pull over. The car obediently slowed down, and Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His partner Rachel sat in silence, unsure of what to say or think. She knew Ethan well enough to sense that something was off, but she wasn't sure if it was just his instincts or something deeper at play. As the car rolled to a stop, Ethan stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his uniform. He approached the sedan with purpose, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a sense of authority that seemed to carry more weight than it should. Ethan worked outside the circle of patrol cars. Naomi, seated calmly in the passenger seat, noticed the officer approaching. She glanced at Daniel, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. The tension in the air was palpable, but Naomi wasn't one to let fear control her actions. She had been through much worse in her career as a police officer. A small, quiet voice inside her told her to stay calm and composed, no matter what. As Ethan approached, his eyes flickered to Naomi. There was something about her, something about the way she sat there that seemed to rub him the wrong way. His suspicion flared again, stronger this time, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Without a word, he motioned for Naomi to roll down the window. "Good morning, officer," Naomi said, her voice steady, offering a polite smile. "Is there a problem?" Ethan's eyes moved over her, his gaze lingering too long on the expensive fabric of her dress. He wasn't used to seeing people like her in this neighborhood, people who didn't belong in his world. Something about her calmness, made him uneasy. He didn't trust her, didn't trust anyone who had what he couldn't. "What are you doing in this area?" Ethan's voice was sharp, his suspicion now more than just a passing thought. "We're just heading to a family event," Naomi replied evenly, her calm tone masking the tension in the air. Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning the interior of the car for any signs of trouble. His gaze fell on the polished leather seats, the luxury of the vehicle. "Nice car," he said, his tone mocking now. "Must have cost a pretty penny. Or did you borrow it from someone?" Naomi's brow furrowed, but she kept her voice steady. "This car belongs to my family. We haven't done anything wrong." His face started to lighten. He frowned. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment, the silence between them thickening. The tension was rising, but Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She knew what this was. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize the signs of someone who was trying to assert control, to make a power play where there didn't need to be one. She was ready for whatever was coming. Naomi took a slow breath and rolled down the window, keeping her movements deliberate and composed. The cool morning air entered the car, a sharp contrast to the tension that was beginning to simmer between her and Officer Grayson. She met his gaze steadily as she handed over her papers, her fingers light but firm as she passed the documents to him. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Naomi's voice was clear and calm, though beneath the surface her mind was alert, processing every small detail. She wasn't about to let her composure slip. She had been in tense situations before. This was just another one, and she would handle it as she always did, with control and resolve. Ethan inhaled and let out a long breath before responding. He stepped back, approaching the wall behind the office, his eyes scanning them quickly, though they were clearly unfocused, distracted by something deeper. He took a moment before looking back at Naomi, his expression a mixture of frustration and suspicion. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, his tone barely hiding the irritation in his voice. Naomi didn't flinch. She knew this was about more than just paperwork. She could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his hand gripped the papers a little too tightly. But she kept her voice steady, her demeanor unshaken. "We're just heading to a family event," she said firmly, keeping her gaze steady, hoping to diffuse any escalation. "Everything's in order." Ethan's eyes drifted to the car, then back to her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes before he spoke again, his voice taking on a mocking edge. "Nice car. Must have cost a pretty penny. Or did you borrow it from someone?" His tone was thick with derision, like he was trying to find any reason to question her, anything to prove that she didn't belong in this neighborhood. Naomi's expression remained calm, though inside a quiet anger began to form. She had dealt with this kind of suspicion before, people questioning her simply because of her appearance, her success, her family. But she wouldn't let it shake her. "This car belongs to my family," she said. "We haven't done anything wrong." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he stood there, lingering on her with an intensity that made Naomi's skin prickle. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the judgment behind it, though she wasn't about to let him see that it affected her. Beneath the surface, though, Naomi was keenly aware of the unfairness of the situation. He was judging her, not for anything she had done, but because of who she was, because of the car she drove, the life she led. His assumptions were clear, and though Naomi knew better than to let it show, a small part of her felt the sting. Still, she didn't back down. She kept her posture straight, her eyes locked with his, a quiet defiance in the way she stood her ground. "We're just passing through," she added, her voice still steady, but now with a subtle undercurrent of authority. "If that's all, officer, we'll be on our way." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His frustration was building, the discomfort palpable as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that Naomi, her family, and this car didn't fit in his view of this neighborhood, and it irked him. He shifted his weight, his posture rigid, then grunted, as if trying to suppress a deeper irritation. But Naomi could see through the mask. "You think you can just waltz in here, drive that car through my town, and not expect any questions?" His words were sharp, biting, a hint of a sneer twisting at the edges of his mouth. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Naomi to catch it. The tone was laced with contempt, though he tried to mask it with a cold, authoritative front. Naomi's eyes flickered, but she kept her expression steady. Inside, the anger that had been building was now replaced by a cool sense of resolve. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to provoke her, to make her react, to somehow justify his actions. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She had seen this kind of behavior before, heard these kinds of words from people who didn't understand, but she wasn't about to let it define her. While this group, "I'm just trying to get to a family event," she said again, her voice still clear, but now carrying a more definitive weight, a firm assertion of her place in this world. "Nothing more, nothing less. So unless there's something specific you need from me, officer, I think we're done here." Ethan glared at her for a moment longer, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the power struggle. But even as he stood there, trying to assert his authority over her, Naomi knew that she had already won this round. The tension in the air grew thicker as Ethan's hand tightened around his baton. His patience was wearing thin, and Naomi could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, the subtle flick of his jaw. He was angry, his suspicions now overriding any semblance of professionalism. Without warning, he barked, "Out of the car, now!" Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped this wouldn't escalate, but she knew this moment was coming. She glanced briefly at Daniel, who exchanged a worried look with her before giving a slight shake of his head. He was just as confused as she was, but Naomi kept her focus. She had to remain calm. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone watching. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her, sharp and accusing, as though expecting her to make a move he could use against her. She stepped out of the car with deliberate calm, trying to maintain control over her movements. Despite the rising tension, Naomi's voice remained steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. Given my past experiences with the law," she replied. "It's hard to ignore something like this that happened 100 years ago." Ethan sneered, the corners of his mouth twisting in a bitter smirk. "Step back and stand next to the car," he ordered, his voice cold and harsh. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Naomi complied, slowly stepping back as her eyes scanned the area. She could already feel the eyes of onlookers on her, some of them raising their phones to capture the unfolding scene. Naomi's gaze flicked towards her family, Daniel and the kids. Daniel's expression was filled with worry, and Naomi caught Ella's frightened glance before Mason, ever the brave one, shifted in his seat, trying to hide his concern. Her daughter looked calm and set. The crowd had gathered quickly, their whispers rising as they began to pull out their phones. Naomi's face remained unreadable, but she could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with every passing second. She wasn't afraid of being recorded. She had been trained for moments like this, but she was beginning to sense something much deeper, something far more insidious than just a routine stop. Ethan seemed to sense the shift as well. His lips tightened into a thin line, and his eyes narrowed. He stepped closer to Naomi, his body blocking the view of the crowd as he leaned in with a low growl. "Do you think I'm asking for your information, Miss Harper?" Naomi met his gaze without flinching. Every instinct within her screamed to stand her ground, to show him that she wouldn't back down from his intimidation. I haven't done anything wrong, she said again, her voice clear but laced with a quiet strength. Ethan's eyes flashed with something darker. He took a step closer, pushing her back with his presence. If you don't cooperate, I'll find another way to make you explain yourself at the station, he threatened, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she held herself steady. He was trying to provoke her, trying to make her react, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She knew her rights, and she wasn't about to let him use his power to control the situation. Unjustly. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some people now openly questioning the officer's behavior. Naomi could see a few people shaking their heads, their faces scrunched in disapproval. Others were still recording, likely preparing to post the scene online for all to see. She knew that this moment would become bigger than just her, a small spark that could ignite something much larger. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, Rachel stepped forward. The moment was slipping from Ethan's control, and Rachel knew it. She had been watching, her eyes flicking between Naomi and Ethan, but now she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in her words. Ethan, they haven't done anything wrong. We don't need to do this. Ethan's head snapped toward her, his face hardening. His frustration, already boiling over, erupted in an angry snap. What you think doesn't matter, Rachel. I'm handling this. His words were sharp, dismissive, the undertone of contempt clear. Rachel stood her ground, refusing to let the situation spiral further. This isn't handling it, she countered, her voice rising slightly. You're escalating it, and for what? There's no reason for this to go any further. But Ethan wasn't listening. His gaze shifted back to Naomi, as if Rachel had disappeared from his field of vision altogether. He was in full control of the situation, at least in his mind, and no one, certainly not Rachel, was going to tell him otherwise. His shoulders tensed, the muscles in his neck tightening as he fought to regain the power he felt slipping through his fingers. Naomi could feel the tension between Rachel and Ethan, a new pressure building as her partner tried to step in. She knew Rachel was trying to protect her, trying to stop this from escalating further. But Naomi had a sense that Rachel was beginning to realize just how deep the problem went, and that realization would change everything. Ethan's attempt to reassert control only made the crowd more vocal. Naomi's eyes flicked over them once more, the quiet support of the bystanders feeding her own resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The murmurs of the crowd, the harsh words exchanged between Ethan and Rachel, and the worried faces of her family. Everything was connected, pulling Naomi into the eye of the storm. But she wouldn't be swept away. Not this time. Her voice rang out again, steady, calm, and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. I have done nothing wrong. I am not going to let you intimidate me or my family. Ethan's eyes burned with anger, but Naomi stood her ground, her back straight, her eyes never leaving his. Ethan's grip tightened around the small plastic bag he had pulled from his pocket. He watched Naomi carefully, his eyes filled with an unsettling satisfaction. The tension between them had reached its peak, and this moment, he believed, would give him the upper hand. Without warning, he dropped the small bag of white powder near Naomi's feet, the movement deliberate, calculated. His lips curled into a smug smile as he stepped back, watching her reaction closely. You were trying to hide this, huh? He sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Looks like I was right. You're hiding something. Naomi's eyes snapped to the bag, her body going still for a moment. Her heart raced, but she refused to show it. Inside, anger flared, hot and sharp, but outwardly, she stayed calm. This was a move she had seen before. She had watched this kind of corruption take root, and she would not let it happen again. Her voice was steady, but the fire behind her words was unmistakable. "That's not mine, and you know it." Ethan's smile deepened, a cold, calculated look on his face. He crossed his arms, leaning back slightly, feigning innocence as if he were the hero in a situation that had already escalated far beyond his control. "I'm just doing my job," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. The crowd, which had been murmuring among themselves in hushed tones, now became more vocal. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, judging, waiting. Their cameras flashed as they captured the scene. A few of them were shaking their heads, some speaking out against Ethan's behavior, their voices rising above the tension. "She hasn't done anything wrong. This is harassment," one of the bystanders shouted, their voice cutting through the air. Other voices echoed in agreement, some stepping forward, no longer willing to remain silent. Naomi could hear the whispers of support growing louder, the murmurs of disapproval aimed directly at Ethan. Daniel, unable to stay silent any longer, finally spoke up from the car. His voice was filled with a mix of disbelief and anger as he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ethan. "What are you doing? You're crossing the line, Grayson." Ethan's head snapped in Daniel's direction, his expression hardening immediately. The tension in the air shifted, as if everyone held their breath, waiting for the next move. Naomi could feel the heat of the moment, the weight of the situation threatening to break. Ethan's voice dropped low, a threatening growl. "Stay in the car. If you interfere, I'll consider your whole family involved." His words were meant to intimidate, to force Daniel back into submission. But the words only ignited the fire that had been smoldering in Daniel's chest. Without missing a beat, Daniel's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "I'm stepping out. You've gone too far." The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of a father's protective instinct, of a man who was no longer willing to stand idly by while his family was targeted. Naomi's heart swelled with pride for her husband. She knew him to be a man of patience and understanding, but there was a line, and Ethan had crossed it. Naomi didn't take her eyes off Ethan. She could feel the threat in the air, but she was no longer afraid. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up against the abuse of power, against the injustice that had been lurking beneath the surface of her own experience in law enforcement. She wasn't going to let Ethan use her to fuel his own prejudices. As Daniel opened the car door, his movement deliberate and steady, the crowd grew more restless. Naomi saw a few more phones pointed in her direction, the cameras documenting the unfolding chaos. But for every camera, there was a face in the crowd showing support, their expressions hardening in response to Ethan's actions. Ethan's gaze flickered from Daniel to the crowd, his eyes flashing with irritation. He wasn't used to this. The power he wielded, the control he believed he had over the situation, was slipping. Naomi could see it in his eyes. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was desperate to salvage what little control he had left. But Naomi wasn't going to let him manipulate the situation any longer. "You can try to intimidate me all you want," she said, her voice unwavering. "But it won't work." She stepped forward slightly, her posture strong, unwavering, embodying a quiet confidence that seemed to spread through the crowd. Ethan took a step back, narrowing his eyes. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation shifting. He had underestimated Naomi. He had thought her an easy target, someone he could push around, someone who wouldn't dare stand up to him. But Naomi wasn't that person. She had stood tall in far worse situations, and this was no different. The murmurs in the crowd continued to grow louder, the pressure mounting against Ethan as more people began to voice their disapproval. Naomi could feel the collective energy of the crowd pushing back against the injustice unfolding before them. She angrily called the people to halt. "Enough," Naomi said, her voice ringing out, cutting through the tension. This ends now." "What?" Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his hands twitching as if he was debating his next move. The air was thick with the unspoken promise that this moment would define everything that followed. Naomi knew that this was not just about her, or even about Ethan. It was about the collective action of people standing together, refusing to let fear and intimidation rule their lives. The silence between them stretched, but Naomi stood firm, her eyes locked with Ethan's. She wasn't backing down. And she knew that no matter what happened next, this moment would resonate far beyond this street corner. The fight for justice was only just beginning. The moment hung in the air, charged with the weight of everything that had come before. Naomi stood tall, her expression unwavering, and the crowd seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Ethan, for all his attempts to maintain control, could feel the power slipping from his grasp. Naomi wasn't just some civilian. She wasn't just someone he could intimidate or manipulate into submission. Naomi stepped forward, her boots clicking against the asphalt, a deliberate and steady sound. She met Ethan's eyes with a gaze that didn't flinch, didn't waver. Her voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "I am Captain Naomi Harper," she said, the words clear and strong. "I've served in the police force for over 15 years. The story echoed in my mind afterward, my thoughts surging forward instantly with each new idea. I started through the onlookers. A brief overlap followed. The impact of her words was immediate. The crowd, which had been murmuring under their breath, fell silent for a split second. Then, like a ripple in a pond, the whispers spread through the onlookers, their voices low but growing louder. "She's a captain! How dare he treat her like that?" One voice shouted from the crowd, a mix of disbelief and anger. The shock and outrage spread like wildfire, echoing through the gathered spectators. Naomi could see the way their eyes shifted, their gaze now turning toward Ethan with open judgment. No one had expected this. No one had realized the officer they were watching so callously had been a leader in law enforcement herself. Ethan's face twisted in frustration. The revelation should have been a victory for Naomi, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He sneered at her, trying desperately to keep his control intact. "So what?" he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're still breaking the rules. That bag of powder says otherwise." Naomi's gaze didn't falter, nor did her voice. She took another step forward, letting her presence dominate the space between them. "That bag isn't mine," she said, her words laced with quiet fury. "And if you think you can frame me in front of all these people, you've made a grave mistake." There was no doubt in her mind now. This wasn't about a routine traffic stop anymore. This was about power, about someone trying to use the system to get away with something far worse. Naomi could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on her, could hear the murmurs growing louder. But this time, she wasn't backing down. As if on cue, a voice rang out from the crowd, a man with a phone in his hand, clearly recording the entire incident. "I've recorded everything, officer," he said, his voice rising above the chatter. "Your actions are not just suspicious, they're an abuse of power." The crowd fell silent again, all eyes now on the man with the phone. Naomi didn't have to turn around to know that this moment was being captured, that it would be shared far beyond this street corner. She could already feel the shift. The power was no longer in Ethan's hands. The crowd was no longer passive observers, but active participants in what was unfolding. Ethan's eyes flickered to the man with the phone, then back to Naomi. He could feel the walls closing in, the realization dawning that this wasn't going the way he had planned. His grip tightened on his baton, but the movement felt futile now. The crowd had seen too much, and the presence of the recording was the final blow to any hope of escaping accountability. Naomi, sensing the change in Ethan's posture, pressed her advantage. "You may think you can control this, that you can get away with it," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But there's no escaping the truth now. Everyone here knows what you've done." The lawyer in the crowd, still holding up his phone, nodded firmly, his face set with resolve. "This is the beginning of your downfall, officer," he added, his voice ringing with certainty. "The truth has been captured. Your actions will be exposed." Ethan stood there, his face flushed with rage, but he was unable to move. The weight of the situation, the eyes of the crowd on him, the phone recording his every word and action. It was all too much. For a brief moment he considered fleeing, but Naomi's words and the mounting pressure from the crowd stopped him in his tracks. He had miscalculated, underestimated Naomi, and now there was no way out. The lawyer continued, his tone growing more resolute with each word. "You've made a dangerous mistake today, officer, not just with her, but with all of us watching. We won't let you get away with this." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and Naomi's stance grew even firmer. She had been through many challenges in her life, but this one was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged, for every person who had suffered at the hands of those who thought they were above the law. Naomi turned her attention back to Ethan, her voice low but filled with finality. "You can no longer hide behind your badge. You will face the consequences of your actions, and it will be in front of everyone here. You will be held accountable." The officer's face, once full of smug confidence, was now tinged with fear. He stood there, a man who had abused his power and now realized the full weight of his actions. The recording would be the evidence that could change everything for him, for the system that had allowed him to act with such impunity. The crowd began to murmur again, the words of support for Naomi and condemnation for Ethan growing louder. Naomi could feel the energy shifting, the support of the people around her solidifying her resolve. This wasn't just a confrontation between her and Ethan. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for change. As the recording continued, Naomi knew this moment would be the spark for something larger. It wasn't just about her standing up to one officer. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, every person whose voice had been silenced. And with that realization, Naomi Harper stood taller than ever before. She had taken the first step, and the fight for change had only just begun. As Naomi stood her ground, the crowd around them growing more vocal in support, Rachel couldn't stand by any longer. She had watched as Ethan escalated the situation, her gut telling her that this had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. There was a part of her that had hoped the situation would resolve itself. But now, seeing the injustice unfold before her eyes, she knew that staying silent would make her complicit. Rachel stepped forward, her gaze fixed firmly on Ethan. The tension between them was palpable, but there was no turning back now. She had to take a stand, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for. "This has gone too far, Ethan," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm, carrying the weight of her resolve. "There's no reason to hold them up like this. Naomi and her family haven't done anything wrong." Ethan's eyes snapped to Rachel, his posture instantly shifting. His frustration, already on the edge, now boiled over, and his face twisted in anger. He took a step toward Rachel, his voice rising. "If you don't want to be reported for insubordination, Rachel, step back." The words hit Rachel like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She had heard them before, the empty threats of a man trying to hold on to whatever control he had left. The power he thought he wielded over her, over this entire situation, was slipping away, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Rachel squared her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "I've seen enough," she said, her voice resolute, each word like a declaration. "I'm not staying silent anymore." The crowd, which had been watching in tense silence, began to murmur, sensing the shift in the air. Naomi's eyes flickered toward Rachel, gratitude and solidarity shining in her gaze. This was a pivotal moment. Rachel was standing up for what was right, for justice, and for the truth that Ethan had tried to bury under his arrogance. Ethan, now visibly shaken, clenched his fists at his sides, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Rachel. His posture became defensive, almost as if he could physically ward off the challenge she presented. "You're ruining your career," he snarled, his voice low and full of venom. "You don't understand how the world works." Rachel met his glare with calm determination, her expression hardening. She had heard this before too, the rhetoric meant to silence, to control. It was a version of the same story he had tried to tell himself, the same lie he had built his own world around. She could see it now, the way he clung to his old beliefs, the way he tried to make his power seem like the only truth that mattered. But it wasn't the truth. Not anymore. "I understand more than you think, Ethan," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I understand that what you're doing here isn't right, and I won't stand by and let you destroy someone's life over your prejudices." Ethan's teeth ground together, his anger seething beneath the surface. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to enforce his version of the law. But now, with Rachel challenging him, and Naomi standing firm, he realized he had lost it. The calm facade he had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and all that was left was a man desperate to cling to the power he thought he held. "You have no idea what you're doing," Ethan continued, his voice rising in frustration. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? This system doesn't work the way you want it to. The world doesn't work the way you think it does." Rachel's expression softened, but only slightly. She had heard him, his bitter, twisted version of reality, a version that justified his actions. But she had lived in the real world long enough to know better. The system could be changed. It had to be. And it started right here, right now. That dark sky sweeping into the dark world to provide for endless nights. But Rachel was far from a hero in the world right now. "The system can change," Rachel replied firmly, "but only if people like you stop hiding behind it to justify your actions. You're not above the law, Ethan, and neither am I." Rachel said, her mind still on her pretended miseries. Ethan stood there, his jaw clenched, his breathing heavier now, as if the weight of Rachel's words was finally starting to sink in. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and anger, his grip tightening on his baton. "Don't you dare try to lecture me, Rachel," he growled, taking a step forward, his anger now boiling over. "You've been in this job long enough to know how things work. Don't pretend like you're some hero here." Rachel didn't move, didn't back down. She knew what she had to do. "I'm not pretending," she said quietly. "But I won't let you use your position to hurt others. Not anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd, watching this exchange, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Naomi, standing a few steps behind Rachel, felt a deep sense of pride. This was it. The moment when the truth would no longer be ignored, when the system would no longer be upheld by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. That was... Ethan's eyes flickered toward Naomi, then back to Rachel. The realization was hitting him hard, harder than he expected. His control, his authority was crumbling, and in its place was the undeniable truth. This was no longer just about him or his badge. This was about accountability, about the consequences of his actions, and about standing up for what was right. But despite all of that, Ethan's pride wouldn't let him concede. "You're making a mistake," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with defeat, but still laced with arrogance. Rachel didn't respond to him. She didn't need to. The truth was already out in the open, and there was no going back for either of them. The tension in the air was electric, and as the moment dragged on, the crowd's emotions surged. What had begun as a quiet observation of a police stop had transformed into a collective outcry. Naomi, standing resolutely in front of Ethan, felt the power shift as the people around her, emboldened by Rachel's stand, began to shout in unison. "Justice! Justice! Enough is enough!" The chants grew louder, each word reverberating down the street, a clear demand for accountability. The voices of the crowd weren't just a reaction, they were a statement, a unified call for change that could no longer be ignored. Naomi stood tall amidst the noise, her confidence shining through as she looked Ethan squarely in the eyes. "You can't escape responsibility," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd's growing roar. Her words were simple, but they were undeniable. Everyone here sees the truth. There was no longer any question of whether Ethan would get away with what he had done. The evidence was in plain sight, and the people were no longer willing to look the other way. "Now," the others asked for testimony. "Who would be brave enough to do this again?" I asked. "You decided to pass this examination, disappear, didn't you?" Ethan, standing there in the face of the rising tide of anger, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted around at the faces in the crowd, the growing number of witnesses who had captured every moment. He could feel the weight of their stares, their judgment. His hands clenched into fists, his frustration building to the point where his control was all but gone. Then, as if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the cacophony of voices. The crowd parted as a black SUV pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing but its sirens silent. Lieutenant Mark Wesson stepped out of the vehicle, his tall frame commanding attention. There was no mistaking the authority in his presence. He moved with purpose toward the center of the scene, where Ethan stood, and his sharp eyes scanned the situation. Naomi watched as Wesson approached, a sense of relief washing over her. He was someone she could trust, someone who had always taken justice seriously. This wasn't just any random officer, it was a leader, someone who knew how to restore order when things had gone horribly wrong. Lieutenant Wesson's gaze locked onto Ethan, and the change in the air was palpable. The power had shifted again. The crowd quieted, a collective breath held, waiting for what would happen next. Ethan, standing defensively with his arms crossed, tried to hold his ground, but the reality of the situation was clear. The tide was against him. "Officer Grayson," Lieutenant Wesson said, his voice cold and firm, "you are suspended immediately pending an investigation. Your actions have been documented." Wesson stepped forward. He moved toward the officer. The words hit like a blow, and for a moment Ethan stood frozen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of the suspension, of the impending investigation, was too much for him to process all at once. His entire posture sagged, the facade of confidence and control evaporating in an instant. Naomi, standing just a few feet away, could see the shift in Ethan. The man who had been so sure of his own power now seemed smaller, almost defeated. Ethan gritted his teeth, the sound sharp in the stillness that had descended after Wesson's pronouncement. He could feel his body tremble with barely contained fury, but his hand stayed at his sides, no longer reaching for the baton or anything to defend himself. There was no longer any point in fighting it. He had been exposed, and the consequences were clear. The crowd's murmurs began again, though this time they were tinged with a sense of relief. People were talking to each other, nodding in agreement, their anger simmering down now that they had seen justice start to take shape. Naomi could feel the weight of the collective support surrounding her. This wasn't just her victory. It was the victory of everyone who had ever faced injustice at the hands of those who thought they were above the law. Wesson motioned to two officers who had been standing nearby, their hands resting on their holsters. They moved forward without hesitation, and Ethan knew what was coming. They weren't there to console him, to offer him some last shred of dignity. No, they were there to escort him away, to make sure that he didn't turn this moment into something worse. He had been caught, and now he would face the consequences. Ethan didn't resist. He knew there was no point. Instead, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "You'll all regret this." The words, full of bitterness and spite, were meant to be a last-ditch effort to hold on to some semblance of control. But they fell flat, swallowed up by the chants of the crowd and the cold authority of Lieutenant Wesson. The officers gently but firmly guided Ethan away. His shoulders slumped as they led him toward the patrol car. His eyes stayed focused on the ground, unwilling to meet the eyes of the people who had gathered to witness his fall. Naomi's eyes followed him, watching as he was escorted away in shame, his career effectively over. As the crowd's chanting died down, Naomi stood in the center, a sense of calm settling over her. She had faced down an officer of the law who had abused his power, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of justice tipping in her favor. It wasn't a perfect system, not by any means, but today, things had changed. Rachel stepped up beside her, giving her a look of quiet pride. They both knew that this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. There were still more battles to fight, more systems to change, and more injustices to address. But for now, they had taken the first step in making their world a little bit better. As Lieutenant Wesson turned to speak with Naomi, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their faces filled with quiet satisfaction. This was a victory, small perhaps in the grand scheme of things, but a victory nonetheless, and Naomi was ready to carry it forward, one step at a time. The air was heavy with the sense of victory as the crowd began to disperse, the weight of the moment settling in. Naomi's heart was still pounding, but a deep sense of relief washed over her. She had done it. She had stood her ground, exposed the truth, and taken a stand for justice. The cheers of the crowd had slowly quieted, but the echoes of their support lingered in the air like a promise. The first step had been taken, but Naomi knew there was much more work to be done. As she walked toward her family, Daniel was the first to meet her. His eyes, usually steady and reserved, were now filled with pride and relief. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "You did great," Daniel said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. Naomi smiled at him, her eyes softening as she looked into his gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the day had been heavy, but her family's unwavering support made it feel a little lighter. Ella, unable to hold back any longer, rushed toward Naomi and threw her arms around her. The young girl's hug was tight, as though trying to squeeze out all the worry and fear she had felt earlier in the day. Naomi bent down, her arms enveloping her daughter, a warmth spreading through her heart at the simple gesture of love. "Mom, you're my hero," Ella said, her voice muffled against Naomi's shoulder. Naomi smiled softly, a small chuckle escaping her lips. She pulled Ella back gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart," Naomi said, her voice tender, "but I'm glad you think so." Daniel stood beside them, his pride visible in his eyes. Naomi's gaze flickered between him and their children, the deep love and support they gave her a reminder of why she had to keep fighting. She had always worked to make their lives better, to build a future where her children could thrive. Today, that fight had taken on a new, more personal meaning. Just as Naomi was about to speak again, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly as she saw the name, Lieutenant Mark Wesson. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Naomi glanced at her family for a moment, offering them a reassuring smile before answering. "Hello, Lieutenant Wesson," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a note of curiosity. "Captain Harper," Weston's voice came through, calm but with an undercurrent of respect. "I've been following the situation, and I wanted to speak with you directly. We've reviewed everything, and I have to say, you've shown extraordinary courage today." Naomi felt a warm flush of pride at his words, though she remained composed. She hadn't expected praise. Not today. She had simply done what needed to be done. But hearing it from Wesson, a man she respected deeply, felt different. Stimulated, Naomi asked, "This whistle, would it produce a dissolved glow to prevent my globes from fading?" "You've got an opportunity here," Wesson continued. "We need someone like you to lead an initiative to improve police-community relations, someone who can bridge the gap between the department and the people we serve." Ha! Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't anticipated this. Leading an initiative was a huge responsibility, one that carried the weight of systemic change. But as she listened to Wesson's words, something clicked within her. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to use her position and her experience to create real, lasting change. "I'm honored," Naomi replied, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "I'll do my best." She meant it, every word. She wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. But for the first time, Naomi felt like she had a clear path forward, a way to take everything she had learned, every step she had taken, and channel it into something that could make a real difference. After she hung up the phone, Naomi stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle over her. It wasn't just a role, it was a responsibility, a chance to truly change the system she had been a part of for so long. She turned to Daniel, who had been watching her closely. His expression softened as he saw the mix of pride and surprise in her eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, sensing that something had shifted. Naomi smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Lieutenant Wesson offered me a leadership role. He wants me to head an initiative to improve police-community relations." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but then his face broke into a smile. "That's incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I knew you had it in you. You've been fighting for what's right your entire career. Now you get to do it on a larger scale." Naomi nodded, a mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that with her family by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Ella looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "Does this mean you'll be even busier, Mom?" Naomi knelt down to Ella's level, her expression softening. "It might mean more work, but it also means I'll be able to make things better. For you. For everyone." Ella smiled, clearly pleased with her mother's words. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Her hand moved to the thought of how often she'd seen her daughter. Naomi kissed the top of her daughter's head, feeling the weight of her family's support surrounding her like a warm embrace. This was just the beginning, and together they would face whatever challenges came their way. Naomi was ready to bring about the change she had always believed in, and, with her family's unwavering support, there was nothing that could stop her. The sun had begun to set as Naomi drove home with her family, the golden light streaming through the car windows. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like a reprieve after the storm of the past few hours. But Naomi knew that the calm was temporary. What had happened today was only the beginning of something much larger, a journey that would take time, effort, and most importantly, commitment to seeing it through. Rachel, sitting beside her, turned to Naomi with a look of quiet understanding. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of everything they had both fought for. "We'll make this change together. You should go." Naomi nodded, her eyes focused on the road ahead, but her mind was racing. There was a fire inside her now, one that burned brighter than ever before. She wasn't just fighting for her career or her family anymore. This was bigger than that. It was for every person who had been silenced, for every injustice that had been swept under the rug. It was for the future, for the kind of world she wanted her children to grow up in. "We'll do this right, not just for us, but for everyone," Naomi replied, her voice steady, filled with resolve. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had learned in her years as an officer, and everything she had learned today about courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right. The car was quiet for a moment as Naomi's family took in her words. Ella, who had been unusually quiet during the drive, spoke up from the back seat, her voice soft but clear. "I think you'll make a difference, Mom," she said, her eyes shining with admiration. Naomi glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting her daughter's gaze. She smiled, but the smile was tinged with something deeper, a quiet understanding of how much was at stake. "I hope so, sweetie. I really do." Daniel, driving in the front seat, spoke next, his voice calm but firm. "We're with you every step of the way, Naomi, whatever it takes." Naomi's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had always known that her family was her greatest source of strength, but today they were also her greatest support. They had seen her through the toughest moments of her career, and now, as she stepped into this new role, they would be there to help her face the challenges ahead. As they drove through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from an easy victory, but the kind that came from knowing she had taken the first step towards something real, something meaningful. The work ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. However, even as Naomi began to feel the comfort of the familiar surroundings, there was a lingering thought in the back of her mind, a question that refused to let go. What kind of change would it take to truly make a difference? Was it enough to work from within the system, or would the entire system need to change? And, perhaps most importantly, could one person's determination really change the world? Or was it the collective will of the people that would make the real difference? These questions would haunt her in the days and months to come, but for now, Naomi allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had taken a stand when it mattered most, and now her journey was just beginning. But the road ahead would not be easy. She could feel the weight of the responsibility already pressing on her shoulders, the knowledge that one misstep could unravel everything she had worked for. As they turned onto their street and pulled into their driveway, Naomi looked at her family, her solid foundation. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that no matter what, she had made a promise to herself, to her family, and to her community. This was just the beginning of a journey, but the steps she took today would leave an indelible mark on the path forward. What she had learned from this fight, and from the support of those around her, was that change wasn't easy, but it was possible. It had to be. As Naomi stepped out of the car and into her home, the question lingered, a quiet reminder of the work still to be done. Could true justice ever be fully realized, or was it a constant, evolving struggle? It was a question that would drive her forward every day.